Thank you, Bev. Thank you, Smart Growth America. Special thanks to each and every one of you for being here today. If you're able to stand at this moment, please stand. Thank you very much for standing. My mother always told me since I was 3, whenever I entered a room, people should stand. So thank you. Thank you for standing. You can have a seat now. Thank you. I feel special. I feel welcome. As we would say in the military, as you were. Thank you. So my name is Charles T. Brown, and today I come to talk to you about arrested mobility, the importance of centering not just equity, but racial equity in transportation access and mobility. The topic of arrested mobility is by far the most important topic in the world to me at this moment. Reason being is because we oftentimes talk about equity, but we don't get specific enough to address the root causes. We deal oftentimes with just the symptoms. So today is an attempt to show you a root cause. And this diagnosis of arrested mobility is just that. But before we start, let's get on the same page in regards to equity in terms of how I see equity. Equity, quite simply, is the guarantee of fair treatment, access, opportunity, and advancement, while at the same time striving to identify and eliminate barriers that have prevented the full participation of some groups. But this principle of equity that we talk about acknowledges to a degree that there are historically and underserved and underrepresented populations. But as I travel throughout the world to talk about equity, if I want everyone to get on the same page with me, I simply need to say equity involves trying to understand and give people what they need to enjoy full, healthy lives. So regardless of one's political orientation or otherwise, when you say it that way, it doesn't rub them in a way where they feel like they need to oppose equity. However, I am not shy. I am a truth teller. So when it comes to equity, I have to push further and let them know it's not simply that. Equity is also the presence of justice and fairness within the procedures, the processes, and most importantly, the distribution of resources by institutions or systems. But equity isn't just that. See, facing equity issues requires an understanding of the underlying or the root causes of inequality and oppression within our society. And so many people are saying that they are equity experts, they're in it, they understand the root causes. Well, if you're going to work in the Black community, one of the things you need to be able to do is complete the following sentence. God is good. All the time. If you find yourself not being able to complete that sentence, you need to look to your left and to your right, as we say in the Black church, and work with that person to understand why they knew that and you didn't. That's very important because Candace Owens got it incorrect on The Breakfast Club. And she's a Black woman, someone I respect, but she wasn't culturally sound in terms of what it means to acknowledge culture in the Black community. And this is important because when we talk about racial equity, there's no doubt that equity leads you to a conversation about race. Race is at the center because so many of the disparities that we see, regardless of the data, point to a need to focus more explicitly on racial equity. And that racial equity is going to lead you to transforming the behaviors, the institutions, and the systems that disproportionately harm people of color. But don't aggregate even people of color because not all of their experiences are the same. So in short, it is about increasing access to power. It is about redistributing and providing additional resources and eliminating barriers, but it is not about excluding everyone else. And so as a professor of urban planning, as a historian, someone who loves this topic, I'm here to tell you without a doubt that when you look at the history of urban planning, transportation in particular in this country, what you find is that urban planning, like many sectors, has been weaponized as a tool of oppression within our society. And it goes unnoticed by many people. But once you see it, you cannot unsee it. And the goal here today is to get you first to see it. Secondly, to act upon it. Why? Because it matters. You look at Louisiana or you look at any black or brown community around this country, and there were systemic attempts to destroy those communities intentionally. We call it highway robbery. But you may not see then the connection that it's having to the climate crises. I was both fortunate and unfortunate to have survived Hurricane Katrina and also Hurricane Sandy that hit New Jersey. No, hurricanes do not follow me. It just so happened that I was put there to have a message at that time. And when we talk about dangers by design reports, I've been fortunate to work with Smart Growth America for many years. The Dangers by Design report is one of the most important reports released when it's released in this country because cities pay attention. But back in 2019, they released a report, and guess what it showed? It showed that older people, people of color, and people walking in low-income communities are disproportionately impacted by traffic violence. When it came to older adults, if you're age 50 or older, raise your hand. Don't do that. We don't want people, ageism is a thing. We don't want that in here. We don't want them questioning your ability to relate because we know you can. We know you are leaders. But the relative pedestrian danger for those age 50 and above was more than a third higher than the general population. So this is 2019. You can go back to 2014, go back to 2012. You also find people of color, 72% more likely to be struck and killed by drivers while walking. Why does this matter to all of us if you're not one of those populations? Well, no matter where you go in this country, at some point you're going to find yourself in a low-income neighborhood. And those who live and walk and traverse through these low-income neighborhoods are also disproportionately more likely to be struck and killed. But as I work with engineers and planners and others across the country, guess what the response was? It's behavioral. It's all about the choices that we make. Now, there is some truth about our behavior, but that's not the whole truth. See, the whole truth is that it isn't that you start downstream. You just move from a behavior to a disease and injury and then ultimately to a mortality. See, those who understand know that there's a bidirectional relationship between the social inequities, how we're treated among class, race, immigration status, gender, et cetera, with its relationship to the institutional systems that determine the environment, which influences the behavior, which ultimately leads to mortality. And unfortunately, because of those social inequities among black and brown people, you see disparities in traffic violence, in mortality, et cetera, among them. So the real truth isn't that simply based on how you act is going to lead to your mortality. The real truth is that race determines place, which ultimately determines health. And your zip code is the #1 indicator. And so if that is true, which I know it is true, all you have to do is look at the data. But again, you got to know what to look at. Here's Peoria, Illinois. I had an opportunity to work with Peoria people there for quite some time. And what this map is showing you, the blue represents predominantly where people who are white live. The green represents where black and African Americans live. Hispanics are represented by purple. Our other races and ethnicity, including Asian, are represented by the other colors. What you're seeing in Peoria is a reality that if one lives in a white neighborhood, they will almost never go to a black neighborhood. And a lot of people in the black neighborhood won't get the opportunity to go to an affluent white neighborhood. Now, what you see, some of you may see, is racial residential segregation. That is true in Peoria, but that's also true in Detroit. That is also true in Houston, Texas. And unfortunately, that is true in Atlanta, as well as in the nation's capital. Anyone can tell you when you ask the question, where are the black people in Washington, D.C., what are they going to say? Which part? The Southeast. The map shows you that. But people will ask, well, New York isn't that way. Yes, it is. New York is very, very diverse, but also very, very segregated by race. And so then people ask me, well, are there any exceptions? And I always tell them, go to Portland where there are no black people and you won't have this problem. But see, that's a joke. But that's also true. Because see, for a very long time in the state of Oregon, if you were black, you couldn't even move there by law. So this is systemic. This is structural. So what this says to us is that history doesn't say goodbye. History says see you later. And later is today. Because that Dangerous by Design report that was released back in 2019, guess what? The most recent one said the same thing. Black and Native Americans are dying disproportionately. Guess what the 2024-2023 one is going to say? Black and Native Americans are dying disproportionately. The question is, why isn't it changing? Why don't we see a change? It isn't because the report is awesome. I said it's awesome. It's because people want to deal with the symptoms of the problem and not the root cause. The root cause is that black and brown people are dying disproportionately because their communities are not invested in or maintained to the same degree as their counterparts. And so what you have then is a plethora of federal, state, and local initiatives, plans, and programs from Complete Streets, which is awesome. I support it. Vision Zero, I support it. Save for policing. Safe Streets, I support it. 15-minute cities, I support it. But what those programs need to do more critically is center race. There has to be a conversation about race because when you look at the truth, what we find is that most of these programs are ahistorical and apolitical, particularly in regards to the history of systemic and institutional racism within this country. We find that they almost never discuss the role of discriminatory law enforcement in keeping black and brown people from moving freely throughout a space. And we also see that there are some tangible mentions of DEI, but that E should be changed to RE. Because yes, everyone deserves a right to live freely in this country, move as they wish, but it is racial equity that is the problem, which is the central theme of this conversation. Also, there's no mention of the unconscious biasness in the simple criminalization of blackness in this country. I debated going for a run last night in my black hoodie. That's always a debate within my mind. No matter where I am, rich, poor, affluent, no matter what the neighborhood is, choosing to wear that black hoodie is an act of resistance, just to run. But some of you may not see it, so we move on. We talk about DEI again. Racial equity, I think, is even more important. But then lastly, all of the people in public health, not all. I got Jamila, I got a few other people here I gotta be accountable to, so I don't wanna say all. So I'm gonna just say all, just for the sake of, until it changes. They say, well, Charlie Brown, and I remind them, I'm not Charlie Brown, I'm Franklin in that episode, but that's a different conversation. But Charlie Brown, these are social, determinants of health. These are not social determinants of health. These are political determinants of health. Everything we do in America results from a political process, whether you know it or not. It's called a democracy. So I bring forth arrested mobility because I want you focusing on the ways in which we are policed in multiple ways that may be visible and invisible. So what is arrested mobility? It is a very bold assertion that black people and other minorities have been historically and presently denied by legal and illegal authority the inalienable right to move, to be moved, or to simply exist in public space. Now, this isn't just a presentation. This is a challenge. I want you to disprove this. I've gone around the world asking people to disprove it. And what I'm going to show you today are data that supports that this is a truth in hopes that you as an ally can do something about it. Because there are these adverse social, political, economic, and health effects that are widespread and they're intergenerational, but they're also preventable, which is why we're here today to talk about it. So what's the framework for arrested mobility? Well, as shown here, arrested mobility is a direct manifestation of racism across 4 distinct realms of racism: the personal, the interpersonal, the institutional, and the cultural, combined together to simply be structural racism. But see, these collective realms of racism have resulted in the social construct of race as we know it, not just locally, but also globally. And what they've led to is the deliberate targeting and over-policing of Black and brown people in this country. This includes, and I want you to see this clearly, their physical mobility directly. Indirectly, it includes their social or their upward mobility. And now variables are pretty nuanced, so understand that some of these direct relationships do have to be tested, but let's have a conversation about what does the data say. So at this point, some of you may be wondering, well, how are they over-policed? Well, it starts with redefining what we mean by policing. See, for me, policing is also planning and policy work, whether we're talking racial residential segregation or zoning, or people's ability to simply choose not to invest in a community. That is a form of policing. Secondly, we have, of course, your more traditional form of law enforcement, which is policing, but it's at multiple levels of governments. And then lastly, and I apologize in advance to all those named Karen, we have the Karens. Both male, female, and they. We have the Karens. But that's polity. That's a system of ideologies which feel that they have control over planning and policy and law enforcement to restrict the mobility of Black and brown people in public space. All you have to do is Google Karen or Ken. Sorry, Ken. So is there evidence to support it across these different transportation modes? How does this manifest in the real world? Well, unfortunately, all we have to do is look at, when it comes to walking, the recent cases and not so recent of Ahmaud Arbery, Trayvon Martin, and Mike Brown. See, Ahmaud Arbery was killed by a self-deputized citizen, such as a Karen. Trayvon Martin, the same thing. Mike Brown, policing. In the news, that looks different. But when you understand the relationship between these characters, you understand that there's a system in place that was meant to do exactly what happened. We can go as far back as slave patrols, but we want for the sake of time. But what does the data say in regards to walking? Well, when you go to Jacksonville, Florida, an analysis of data showed that 55% of the tickets were issued to Black individuals, even though only 29% of the population identifies Black. In fact, we found that Blacks were 3 times more likely to receive a ticket than whites. And then when you bring income into the mix, residents of the city's 3 poorest zip codes were about 6 times as likely to receive a pedestrian citation. Now, that becomes critical when you consider a case in Atlanta like Raquel Nelson, a Black single mother and college student who lost her son, in a hit and run while crossing the street to their apartment. I think she was convicted, but later it was overturned. And thankfully, what they discovered is that the man who killed her son due to this flawed environment was later found and admitted to drinking and taking painkillers on the night the son was killed. But when it comes to arrested mobility, I just wish it ended at walking or running. It also goes into cycling. And if you know cycling, it's the sexiest of all the modes. It really is. You go to any conference, and the room is packed. Everyone is like, I'm a cyclist. Yeah, right. Some of you are, but we can talk about that later. Some of you are just recreational cyclists. You're not about those mean streets of DC and New York and Chicago, biking in traffic. But what does the data say as it relates to Black and brown people? Well, when we go to Tampa, Florida, Tampa was really interesting. See, Tampa, we know what Florida is doing politically. I lived there for 6 years, so that's my second home. Don't critique it. No, critique it. What we find in Tampa is that between 2003, just think about this for a second, in 2015, the Tampa Police Department issued over 10,000 bicycle tickets. Now, they should have been focused on something more important, but they were issuing tickets. But 79% of those tickets were issued to Blacks, even though only 26% of Tampa population identifies as Black. The disturbing part about that is that during that 12-year study period, at least 142 bicycle tickets were issued to kids aged 15 and under, including children as young as 3 years old. Now, are Tampa police officers bored? Like, what's really happening? Perhaps they should go to St. Pete where it's more fun, but we could talk about that too. But we got to go to California because on paper, like New York, everyone considers California a beacon of freedom. If you're black, you're brown, you go there, you're free. That's not true, especially if you're black and you bike in Oakland. Because what we found in Oakland is that 60% of all bicycle stops in Oakland included black cyclists. You want to guess their percentage? Around 25% again. So if you're looking for a place to live and you're black, don't go to a place that's near 24, 25% black. I'm just kidding. But the truth is, if you do go there and you happen to be black, we're seeing some evidences that that's where the discrimination starts, when you start to be around a quarter of the population. But we moved to the Midwest and Chicago. Again, on paper, very liberal, very progressive, but twice as many bicycle citations are written in black neighborhoods than in majority white or Latino neighborhoods. In fact, in one case in Austin, a majority black community, 321 bicycle tickets were issued, whereas only 5 were issued in Lincoln Park, a wealthy majority white community. Now, in the case of arrested mobility, I wish it ended at cycling. It is the sexiest of the mode. If we could end it there, we'll be good to go. No, we won't, because then we got driving. We can't ignore driving. I grew up in a town of but approximately 350 people in rural Mississippi. We depended on driving. You had to drive. The nearest grocery store was 20 minutes away, and it didn't have everything. The nearest McDonald's, yes, that mattered as a kid, was 50 minutes away, and it didn't have a play area. So driving is important in the rural context. And we look at some of the recent cases, we can't forget Philando Castile, Sandra Bland, but then what does the data say? Well, nationwide, we found that black and Hispanic drivers are stopped disproportionately to white drivers. We also know that police are less likely to pull over black drivers after dusk when the race of the driver is less obvious to police. But we then go to the state of Minnesota, where George Floyd was and remained a central topic there. A state commission study in Minnesota found that blacks and Latinos were 7 times more likely to be stopped by police in white majority neighborhoods. In fact, in one case, 47% of the arrests were of black people, even though the patrol area is only 7% black. But in the case of arrested mobility, perhaps it ends at walking, biking, and driving. No, it also includes transit. And for that, we go back to the West Coast and we look at the case of Oscar Grant III, who was a 22-year-old black man who was murdered by BART police officers in Oakland once again. But what does the data say nationwide? Well, when we look first at New York, 89% of those who are black, 89% of those who are arrested are black or Hispanic. In fact, the top 10 neighborhoods in New York City with the highest number of arrests per subway swipe were all predominantly black or Hispanic. And then they had a case where Adrian Napier, a black teenager, was tackled and aimed at by a police officer for fare evasion. That fare was only $2.75. Does the crime justify the force? In that particular case, I don't think so. Now, we joked about there not being black people in Portland or San Francisco, in a few other places. But back in 2017, we have to give Portland some credit. Blacks were 8 times more likely to be charged than whites for certain transit violations in Portland, but they decided to decriminalize that, I think in 2018. So Portland, while we joke about Portland, is progressive oftentimes when it comes to policies around addressing inequities and inequality in our transportation system. But arrested mobility doesn't end there, unfortunately. It also includes when you're hopping a ride share. And there are some really surprising statistics when we look at that black travelers waited on average 20% longer than whites, and 55% of blacks who call for a cab at some point have had a refusal of service by the cab to send it to their community. And so as we look at this data, we cannot forget, of course, the case of Breonna Taylor and Tamir Rice, who was simply a kid in their neighborhood. But we simply have to say, what does this mean from an adverse social, political, economic, environment, and health standpoint? Well, many of you are advancing equitable and inclusive transportation. But please know this, if you don't address arrested mobility, how they're policed, not only through polity, not only through policing, but also through planning, here's what you get as adverse outcomes. Blacks are 54% less likely to be physically active than whites, and that's regardless of their neighborhood income level. So it doesn't matter if you're black and you're rich, guess what? Same outcome. Or you're black and you're poor, same outcome. Areas with larger black population tend to have lower rates of upward mobility. Why is that? Because if your physical mobility is arrested, more than likely your upward or social mobility is arrested. And then lastly, this segregation that I showed earlier in the map, it affects the educational attainment for blacks as well, much more so than whites. And then lastly, what we find is that unfortunately, they have less access to important resources like healthcare, supermarkets, education, and jobs. And then people will say, well, what about the political process? Well, this transportation disadvantage also makes black people vulnerable to disenfranchisement efforts like a lower density of polling places. So when we start voting by mail, that's why you see higher numbers, because transportation disadvantage is a real reality. So at this point, you all may be saying, Charlie Brown, excuse me, Franklin, what can I do about it? Well, I want you to have a different lens, number one. Redefine what is policing. But number two, seek justice. Equity is important, but we need justice. So you start with recognition justice and you ask the question, have we considered the damage inflicted by a lack of recognition or misrecognition? You then argue for distributive justice so that we could see who has physical access to that street, that park, or that trail. If they don't have access, give them access. You then move to procedural justice to see who has influence over the design, the operations, and the programming. I argue if you're more likely to be killed by a system decision, you should be at the forefront of how that system is designed so you can help mitigate, at least from a design perspective, what happens to communities that look like you. And then we have interactional justice. The street can be complete. The street could be without fatalities, as in the case of Vision Zero. The community could be designed as such where you can get anywhere in 15 minutes. But what really makes people feel welcomed or unwanted? And to get to the bottom of that, what we need is representational justice to ensure that cultural erasure doesn't take place as places are gentrifying. And then most importantly, we need restorative justice. And so at this point, many people say, Charlie Brown, we get it. Excuse me, Franklin, we get it. We're in the same boat. And I tell them, we're not in the same boat. We've never been in the same boat. You didn't ride that boat my people came in over. But what we are, we're in the same storm. And there's a huge difference between that. Because when I go to the black barbershop, and I still do, for those wondering, what I'm hearing is that black people are tired, brown people are tired. We can't go jogging, we can't ask for help after being in a car crash, we can't walk from the corner store, we can't walk home with Skittles, we can't get a normal traffic ticket, we can't have a disabled vehicle, we can't run, we can't breathe, we can't live. And it's because our mobility has been arrested. And that's true of my grandmother in her wheelchair or my sister on her bicycle. And so what I need for you to do is to address this illness of arrested mobility. Because without it, you'll simply be advocating for equity only to deal with the symptoms, never to address the root cause. Thank you for your time. Let's take the questions from this room.
Yeah. Question? Yeah.
Thank you. You can have your seat now, as you were. All right, so I welcome any and all questions. Be free. If no one speaks, I'm gonna go into my professor mode, and I'm gonna start calling on people with orange on first, then red, then green, then blue. Question over here, yes.
So this was fantastic, thank you.
Thank you.
Can you point to a couple of solutions or
Yeah, so solutions. We did a report almost a year ago to today titled Arrested Mobility. In that report, we looked at the policies at the state level for all 50 states and the two most populous cities in each state to see if those policies could be, these transportation mobility policies could be sort of enforced in a discriminatory way. And what we found is that there are some policies on the books as simple as if you have a dirty tire, a bicycle tire, you can be pulled over. Of course, we have addressed the issue of jaywalking. So you've seen places like the state of Virginia overturn or decriminalize jaywalking. So that is a result of this report. My ask of you all is that you take a look, you model this report at your city policies. We give you a framework to determine if those policies are more likely to lead to discriminatory outcomes. And we challenge them on the basis that many of them are not even improving safety. And we have, the literature that we could point to that, et cetera, et cetera. And so other outcomes is that we've seen cases in New York, in the case of Lance Rodriguez, where we were able to get the New York Supreme Court to overturn its verdict on how it viewed cyclists versus pedestrian and cars. So I'm not a lawyer, but I'll tell you quickly, there was in New York a lot of stop and frisk. Lance Rodriguez got stopped. He was treated like a pedestrian even though he was on his bicycle. Had he been treated like a motorist, he would not have been stopped. The gun that he had on him would not have been discovered, and he would have been a free man. So the argument was for that cyclists to be treated more like cars, and the New York Supreme Court, I think, agreed with our assessment based upon that ruling. And so you see evidence of that happening. Also, they're probably, what was your question again? Other solutions, invest in infrastructure in Black and brown communities. But don't just stop there. Decriminalize the policies, like I said, that are on the books that are leading to over-enforcement of those communities. The lens that I gave you from a justice standpoint is a solution. Most people are not looking at urban planning through those lenses to ensure that we have greater representation, that we're aiming to restore the harm that was done to communities, or procedurally, how we're going about making decisions. So those are solutions, the processes. Others? It's a lot of people gathering over here, so.
Unfortunately, we do have time for one more? One more. Okay.
So we'll answer two questions to be equitable. Really quickly, Calvin, and then over here. Yes, sir.
Hey, Franklin, how you doing?
All right, man.
Question for you. As we move to more permanent hybrid schedules and Ken and Karen are home in their neighborhoods more often, and downtowns empty out in the evenings, do you think that will exacerbate or change these arrested mobility challenges?
I think it will exacerbate it because people are paranoid and scared. And I can't tell you how often my Ring camera gets a notification that there's a scary Black man in the neighborhood who was only working for DoorDash or delivering a package. So we're going to explore the intersection with technology and arrested mobility because we're seeing increases in calls because of the use of Ring cameras and others, and there being strangers in the neighborhood. So the more time people have to work from home and to monitor their cameras, the more paranoid they are, potentially the more police calls we're going to see. And then over here quickly, and then one last one, and I got to sit down and Beth is going to give, yes.
Hi, Kate Foster. I work for Rails to Trails Conservancy.
Love your work.
I live in Baltimore, and I'm working to develop multi-use trails
Okay.
In majority Black city. And in a couple majority Black neighborhoods where we're working with the city to develop trails to improve safety and mobility in neighborhoods where 40% of residents don't own cars.
Right.
The trail has become a source of very entrenched deep conflict.
Okay.
And there are many, many complex layers. The hardest and most complicated one having to do with race.
Okay, come on, get to the question or you're going to get me in trouble.
Okay, so the conflict, I think the root of it is in infrastructure and like white supremacy being tangled up with infrastructure, ruining neighborhoods and all of that. So I would love to hear you speak to sort of how to work towards the goals of this report and what you talked about, given that the opposition is coming from residents in this majority Black, almost all Black neighborhood.
Yeah, we could talk about that. That's great. Yes, next.
Thank you for your presentation.
Mm-hmm.
Question is the role that it could play in transportation. And we know there are things that
You said affordable housing?
affirmative running for housing rule, the federal rule.
Yes.
And so how can we use tools like that everyone sort of is required to complete to look at things like mobility, because things don't live in silos. And how do we make that connection?
Yeah, you said housing, right? Just to be frank, I mean, to be clear.
Affirmative running for housing rule. Yeah.
So housing and transportation. All right. Very important, super important. It's not a one-size-fits-all, to your point. We have to take a more systems approach to improving things, but housing is certainly a part of it, all right? And we could talk about that later, but I gotta go.
I want to take another chance to thank Charles for his incredible presentation.